Hello and welcome to Monster Mash. It's been a long time. It's been a crazy couple of weeks. I really wanted to talk about a book that I just finished and kind of correlate it to another book that I read that's part of my favorite horror reads. So let's get into it. These two books on the surface feel very different, but the more I sat with them, the more they started to overlap in a really unsettling way. Because some horror stories don't scare you because of what happens in them, they scare you because of what they make you notice in people. Those books are Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay and American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis. And what struck me wasn't just the unreliable narrators or the violence or even the ambiguity. It was how both stories explore what happens when people start to lose their connection to others and how the mind fills in that space. Horror Movie follows the legacy of a disturbing, low-budget experimental horror film made in the 1990s, like 1993-ish, early 1990s. The production itself was chaotic, unsettling, and something clearly went wrong. The movie never finished, but somehow gained a cult following because of its cursed status. So 30 years later, Hollywood decides to reboot the film. The strange, lanky actor who had been recruited to play the Thin Kid, a masked, silent, and frequently abused character in the indie film, has now been pulled back in to possibly reprise his role. And he is the only surviving cast member. Once production begins again, the lines between the past and present start to blur. Memory becomes unstable. Reality becomes questionable. The story is told through fragmented recollections, screenplay excerpts, and the perspective of a narrator we can't fully trust because that narrator is the Thin Kid himself. American Psycho follows Patrick Bateman, a wealthy investment banker living in 1980s Manhattan. On the surface, he's polished, successful, obsessed with status and image. But inside his narration, there are acts of violence, emotional detachment, and a complete collapse of empathy. The book never fully confirms what is real and what isn't. Everything is filtered through his perception. So you're left constantly asking, did this happen? Or is this just how he experiences the world? I think that's where the real horror is. Not monsters, not violence, not even unreliable narration, but the way emotional distance between people can slowly turn into permission. Permission to dismiss, to objectify, permission to harm, and sometimes permission to call it something else entirely. Patrick Bateman exists in a world built on image, status, and performance. People aren't really people to him. They're objects, comparisons, interruptions, and that emotional distance becomes something structural. Because once someone stops being fully human in your perception, your mind starts building a framework where your behavior toward them feels justified, even if that framework is unstable, even if reality itself is uncertain. The Thin Kid in Horror Movie starts from the opposite place. He's not inside anything. He's outside. He's watching, he's observing, he's trying to make sense of something he was never fully allowed to be a part of. And over time, that shifts because observation can start to feel like understanding, and understanding can start to feel like a sort of power. Not because it actually is, but it protects you from the pain of not belonging. And here's something else both of these stories do that I don't think gets talked about enough. It's not just what's happening inside the narrator's mind. It's what happens to our minds. Because when you're inside a story where reality is unstable, where memory and perception don't quite line up, you start trying to make sense of it. You lean in, you fill in the gaps, and somewhere in that process, something shifts. You stop just observing and you start empathizing with the main character, don't you? It's not sympathy, it's not agreement, but empathy in a very specific way because you start to understand how they see the world. And that's where it gets uncomfortable because this kind of empathy isn't passive. It's immersive. You're stepping into a perspective long enough that your own sense of certainty starts to blur. And you're not just watching the story anymore. You're inside the way the story is being justified. This is where both stories really mirror each other. Patrick looks down on people from a place of privilege, right? But the Thin Kid looks down on people from a place of distance. Both of them arrive at the same internal place. Emotional separation becomes a kind of authority, a way of turning a way of turning vulnerability into control, or at least the feeling of control. We can explain it. We can say trauma, we can say emptiness, isolation, conditioning, and all of that might be true. But I still find myself thinking, does understanding someone's psychology soften the accountability? Or does it just make the path clearer? I think what both of these stories are really circling is this. The moment someone stops being fully human to you, whether they feel beneath you, outside of you, or just other, that's where the harm starts to become easier to imagine. And once something becomes easy to imagine, it doesn't stay imaginary for long. So when I think about American Psycho and horror movies side by side, I don't just see unreliable narrators. You know, I see two different expressions of the same psychological defense. When connection feels impossible or unsafe or out of reach, people start to turn that distance into meaning to save themselves from feeling the pain of that distance. And sometimes that meaning becomes superiority. Sometimes it becomes an observation. But in horror movies and in American Psycho, they become a story that the unreliable narrators tell themselves just to survive what they're feeling or not feeling. And underneath all of it, the question stays the same. What do we allow ourselves to believe about other people in order to live with ourselves? And how far does that belief have to go before it stops being just a story? So maybe the real horror in these stories isn't just what people do, but the stories they tell themselves to make it make sense. It's a recurring theme in a lot of the content that I've been bringing up, because the line between you and the monster isn't always as solid as you think. We have to be careful who you call a villain because we're all participants in the dark. Thank you so much for joining me tonight and listening to this episode of Momster Mash. Again, if this resonated with you, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to get in touch with their inner horror junkie. That's why I record these episodes and send them out into the void weekly, because I'm just hoping that someone will howl back. You can find me on TikTok at MomsterLolo, and you can drop me a line at monstermashpodcast@gmail.com. As always, protect your energy and I'll see you in the next one.